Welcome to Citizen Talk, the show that takes the most important political topics of the day and breaks them down so we can think about them in a prudential way. I'm Juan Davalos.
And I'm Brett Waite, sitting in today for Lynette Grunvig. And you're listening to us today on Radio Free Hillsdale 101.7 FM. We're not behind the golden EIB microphone, but we are behind the platinum Radio Free Hillsdale microphone.
Just to one-up Rush Limbaugh.
So, Juan, since we are restoring prudence to politics, what exactly is prudence for our fans of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez who may not be familiar with prudence?
Yeah, they definitely are not familiar with prudence. But prudence is really knowing what the right thing to do is at the right time. So basically, it's somebody that understands what the end that they want to achieve is and having the ability to discern what the right means to achieve that end is, taking into account all the different circumstances in place. And prudence is very important for politics, obviously, because circumstances are constantly changing, but there are eternal principles that we need to keep in mind, things that don't change, and we need to be able to understand what those principles are, and in order to understand how to apply them into our current circumstances. And so one of the things we're going to be talking about today is the Electoral College. A lot of people don't know what that means. They think it's a college or a place of study somewhere. It actually is not. The Electoral College is the way we choose our president and our vice president. Brett, so are you one of those who thinks that the Electoral College is an institution of higher learning?
No, I'm not, actually. The Electoral College is probably best described in Article 2 of the United States Constitution, and it's simply the process we use to select our national executive. And population simply votes for their preference for president, and the way that the electors are chosen is mandated in the Constitution, and the state legislatures are the ones who choose the method of how the electors are chosen.
All right, and I did want to go ahead and give a quick warning to our listeners. There's about 5 minutes in our recording in which there's a bit of a clicking sound. I apologize to our guest today, Ms. Ross, because of that clicking sound, but we were able to get rid of it. So to discuss the Electoral College, we have with us today Tara Ross. Tara Ross is a mother, a wife, writer, and a retired lawyer. She's the author of The Indispensable Electoral College, How the Founders' Plan Saves our country from mob rule, and Enlightened Democracy, The Case for the Electoral College. Welcome to Citizen Talk, Ms. Ross.
Thanks for having me.
So, Ms. Ross, let's jump right into it. And I guess the most obvious question to begin with is, what is the Electoral College?
Well, the Electoral College is the unique way that our country has of electing presidents. And it's actually a two-part system. The first part is the part that people are mostly familiar with. That's when you go to the polls on Election Day, and it looks like you are casting ballots for president. You actually are not. You are casting ballots for presidential electors. So you're voting in a statewide election, not a national election. Most states decide that they award their electors in a winner-take-all fashion. So I'm from Texas. If the Republican wins Texas, then 38 presidential electors are awarded or are considered elected. If the Democrat wins, then 38 Democratic electors are considered elected. And every state operates in a similar manner. These presidential electors that are elected on Election Day then go on to a second phase of the election in December, and those presidential electors cast their ballots in the election that will actually determine who the president of the United States is going to be.
Now, that's a very interesting thing to think about, because we all have this idea that when we go to the voting booth on the first Tuesday of November, we think we are actually having this one national election. But what you're saying is we don't have this one national election. Each state has a separate election, and we have actually 51 because of D.C., 51 elections on that day, and that's what we're doing when we're voting for president.
Exactly, and it is an important point, because you hear people say things like, my vote was wasted, or
right.
It was not democratic, or things like this. None of this is true. It is a statewide election, just like your election for governor or any other statewide office in your state, and there are winners and there are losers, but it is just a purely democratic winner-take-all election at the state level. The question with the presidential election process is not, are we going to have democracy versus no democracy? The question is, will we have democracy by itself, or will we have democracy plus federalism? And of course, the Electoral College chooses democracy plus federalism. Purely democratic at the states, the way it operates today, plus we do a state-by-state, there's a state-by-state portion in the second phase of the election as well.
Now, I just have a quick question based on the electors. In each state, how are the electors chosen?
So that's a good question, too. The electors are chosen slightly different. I mean, each state can make its own choices, but the most typical manner is that the state political party will select its own slate of electors, and then will give that slate to the state. So again, I'm sorry, I'm just going to use Texas a lot because I live in Texas.
Oh, that's right.
That's fine.
So in Texas, the Texas State Republican Party will appoint 38 people. These are our people. If the Republicans elect, this is who we want to represent us if Republicans win. And the Democrats will do the same thing, 38 completely different people.
Mm-hmm.
Or if there's a write-in candidate, they will nominate 38 people that have promised to go vote for that candidate. So and that's just important because when Texas or any other state finishes its election, you really don't have to worry about electors deviating from the popular vote, as you hear people talk about, because these are party people who were selected by the party who want to vote as they have been asked to vote. Which is why, by the way, in 2016, despite all the uproar, despite all the stuff that was going on, at the end of the day, the only people that cast independent votes, with a couple of exceptions, most of the people that cast independent votes were Democrats who knew that their quote-unquote faithless votes were not going to change the outcome of the election. They were just, they were going for something else.
Now, when you're talking about the different states, obviously the question that comes to my mind is federalism. And that seems to be something that's very uniquely American, and that's something that's very important for the subject of the Electoral College. Can you explain a little bit about the difference between like a pure democracy and federalism?
Sure. Well, so a pure democracy is just straight up, I'd say majority rules, but lots of the time it'd probably be a plurality, not even a majority, but just whoever gets the most. The very simple analogy that is sometimes used is a pure democracy is two wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner, which is not a very fair vote for the sheep. It feels great for the wolves.
Right.
but the sheep is treated very unfairly. And so the founders, they knew this dynamic. They knew it from their study of history, and they wanted to create something better. So they, and they had similar. They also, by the way, on the side had these other fears about trying to spread a republic across too great a territory. They just thought the country, 13 states, is too big and too diverse to possibly to govern in this sort of way safely. So federalism, the distribution of power among the states, leaving states sovereign in many spheres, that is something that would protect freedom, because on the things that were the most important to you, your state and your local government should be handling that, not the national government. And that was a very important characteristic of the Constitution to the founders. Now, the presidential election process, of course, just reflects this decision that was made in so many other ways in the Constitution.
Yes, and I just want to go back real quick to the faithless electors. Mm-hmm. Now, is there any way, are they bound by law, state law, to vote a specific way? Or, as you said earlier, that they were bound, they were members of the party, and so they're most likely going to vote for the winning candidate. Is there a way, do some states hold them accountable by state law, or would that be constitutional to do such a thing?
So again, it varies by state, and there's lots of states that do try to bind their electors, and they have a bunch of different ways of doing that. Some states just automatically replace electors who try to deviate, or some states fine them, or there's different. Lots of states have different ways of doing it. Now, the separate question is, can they do that? Right. And there are cases pending as we speak about that very question. They're mostly stuck in questions as procedural questions, and they haven't really gotten to the constitutional one yet. So we'll see. I guess we can watch those cases play out and see what happens. But my take on it is that it probably is not constitutional to bind them. And the analogy that I would use is that, look, if you elect your United States senator, you can't fine them or fire them because you didn't like how they voted on taxes. Your recourse is to elect somebody different the next time. And these are electors who are elected to a constitutional office who then have a duty to perform. It is a relatively limited duty, of course. It's just one vote cast on one day. But there are constitutional officers with that task that's been assigned to them. And, just something to think about. I think it's really easy to get mired down in the facts that were in 2016, what was going on. Remember, there are lots of situations where elector independence might be a good thing. For instance, what if a presidential candidate had a stroke after Election Day but before the meetings of the electors? They're in the ICU. They're doing very badly. Don't we want even our electors to have the freedom to go vote for the vice presidential candidate instead, and just to kind of see what's happening and to act accordingly? I think that some of the difficulty has come about because people don't know their electors, and so they have no reason to trust them, of course. So maybe we could fix some of this just by making the election process more transparent about who the electors are and why we should trust them. Which, of course, again, to go back to this, state thing, is up to the states. I mean, the states are going to have to handle it and do what they want to do.
Perfectly. So, Ms. Ross, we've been talking a little bit about the faithless electors in different ways that we can make our system of electing the president a little more trustworthy for people. But how can we convince people that the Electoral College system is actually a good system rather than an antiquated system that was proper for the 18th century and not for the 21st century?
Well, I mean, the answer is education, as it is with so many issues. It strikes me that most of the support or lack of support, really, both sides, comes from people thinking that this is a political issue. If you supported Donald Trump or George Bush, then you're quote-unquote supposed to support the Electoral College. And if you were for Hillary Clinton or Al Gore, then you're quote-unquote supposed to be against it. I mean, none of this is true. And I think the more you study it and the more you look at what's going on, you realize this institution is not a political institution at all. It is an institution that rewards the candidate that does the best job of coalition building. Now, I happen to think that we are in a period of time where no party is doing an especially good job of coalition building, which is why things are so ugly and angry and divisive right now.
Right.
But guess what? We've been here before. We were here in the years after the Civil War. It was another period of time where there were lots of close elections kind of back to back. It was angry. It was divided. There were even a handful of elections where the winner of the recorded national popular vote was different than the winner of the Electoral College. And what happened in that period of time was that the Electoral College was actually one factor that brought people back together. They had to, because they had no choice. If you're a Democrat in the South, you can't win with only your safe areas. You have to reach out to independents or Republicans who aren't like you. You have to learn about them, what's important. You have to figure out where your similarities are and what your shared goals are and start to appeal to that. Likewise, the Republicans in the North and the Northwest, they could win with only their safe areas, but if the Democrats made any intrusion at all, then they were going to lose. And so over time, finally, people can be stubborn. We can all be stubborn. But over time, the political parties and the candidates finally realized, what, we got to shake this off and move on and be more inclusive and help, reach out to a wide variety of people. And wouldn't you know it, within a matter of decades, you've got people like Calvin Coolidge and FDR winning in huge landslides. So my argument today is, yes, we are in a bad time where nobody's doing an especially great job of coalition building. The first party to get its act together, fix itself, take a hard inward look, is going to start winning in landslides, like FDR or like Reagan.
Right.
That's what the Electoral College historically has done for us. So this movement to get rid of the Electoral College is discouraging, just in the sense of, if we get rid of it, we'll stay in this angry, ugly place forever, because we won't have anything to get us out of it.
That's actually a really good point, because when I think of the Electoral College, if you look at the history of the results of the Electoral College, and you look at the history of the results of the quote-unquote popular vote, which, doesn't exist, it's kind of a fiction, but there are really no decisive victories when you look at the results of the popular vote, which means that it would actually take away the sense of stability and assurance that we have on elections of there's one clear winner. I think the Electoral College does have a very few times. I think there's 3 times in which the popular vote has been won by somebody else that hasn't won the Electoral College vote. But for the most part, the Electoral College has been a tool of stability and assurance for the American people rather than the opposite.
It absolutely has. Here's an interesting little note. One of my books came out in 2 editions, and so I had to change the national popular vote totals in the appendix in the back. And I noticed, so this was between, I guess, 2004 and 2012, some of the vote totals had changed. And I'm talking about from the Kennedy years or something. And I was like, really? And so at first my initial reaction was, oh no, I messed up. But then I went and looked. I looked at the old books, I looked at the new books, and I realized I had not messed up. The totals had changed. They were still changing.
Wow, that's
and
interesting.
I have no idea
know
why. I don't know. Did they find a box of ballots? I don't know. I don't know what happened. But
Broward County, Florida.
Yeah.
It's so weird. I do know in the Kennedy years, because of the way the votes were cast, it's very, very hard to come up with a coherent total. But it was interesting, and I thought that exact same thing. If you're relying upon a hard number for the national popular vote, it is unreachable. There will always be somebody disputing something somewhere, and at least with the Electoral College, look, the electors, that's a known quantity. You cannot mess with that. Once the state has awarded their electors, it's done, and there's no going back and forth. And you can look at other situations, like in 2000 in Florida, a situation like, do we want to conduct a national popular vote, count everything everywhere all over again?
Right.
Sounds like a horrible idea.
Right.
At least in that case, we were isolated to Florida. We solved those problems, and we moved on to a certain and stable outcome, and that is a huge benefit of the Electoral College.
Now, one thing that I think is very important also about the Electoral College, we've talked a little bit about the big states and the small states, and that was a big argument during the founding regarding the reasons for having an Electoral College. You want a president that represents the entire country rather than a president that represents just the big cities or the big states where they're going to get most of the votes. And it's interesting that usually those that are against the Electoral College are against it because they say that the Electoral College disproportions the vote that some people have, and it gives people in smaller states a bigger, powerful vote, more powerful vote than those in more populous states. But and then what they want to do is they want to get rid of the Electoral College to benefit the little guys, so to speak. But they're actually doing the opposite.
I guess I have several thoughts about that. One is there's so many different ways to twist that math. I mean, you will get other people that look at that and say, it's unfair. California has extra power because of the way it's structured. Now, the logic there is because if you're the single vote in California that changes the outcome of the California election, 55 electors go your way, as opposed to Wyoming where only 3 go your way. And mostly what I think is it's all theoretical math, whatever. It's theoretical. What we are looking at is pragmatic. How can you pragmatically make sure that voters across the country that they matter, that they're being paid attention to? And you don't want to create a world where the wolves, no offense to people in big cities, I live in a big city, but the wolves in the big city can just do whatever they want to the sheeps in the country. It's not good. That's not a good situation. That's not healthy. It's not a healthy dynamic. And I think part of what I've been thinking about lately is just this generation, modern American society, we have such an emphasis on individuals and individuals feeling good. And it's not like that's all bad, but the founders had kind of a different mindset. They didn't say to themselves, we want one person in one moment in time in one state, in one county to feel really good and warm and fuzzy about their vote.
Right.
They thought to themselves, we want to create a healthy dynamic that serves our country for generations. And the best way to do that is to have this system that again incorporates, as it works out, democratic and federalist principles to make sure that presidential candidates have incentives to reach out to all parts of the country, not to focus only on cities or only on farms or only on oil interests or whatever the case may be. You have to reach out to a variety of people or you cannot succeed in the presidential election system that we have. And that is really good and healthy for our country.
Mm-hmm. And now, to be fair, I guess, to the those who are supporting the national popular vote, there were some prominent founders who were in favor of having the national executive elected via popular vote. For example, Gouverneur Morris, James Wilson, among others. But that's not what they decided on in the end. And I think that shows the positive effect of coming together and debating and deliberating on what is best for the country. And what would you say to that?
I think the founders just felt really conflicted. I mean, on the one hand, they had just left England because they had no representation in Parliament. They wanted to be self-governing. There was lots of concern at the convention that the president would not reflect the voice of the people. They really wanted that. On the other hand, they also knew, look, even if we had been given representation in Parliament, we would have been outvoted time and time again by the majority of citizens at home in England. And so in the convention, you will find statements on both sides. Mm-hmm. And it's because they were trying to reconcile these conflicting goals. How can you be self-governing, but how can you still protect the rights and the liberties of the minority? And of course, they were especially concerned about the small states. And so the solutions they came up with were compromises between these two positions, and they've been remarkably successful.
Yep.
And we're going to take a short break. You're listening to Citizen Talk, the show that restores prudence to politics. I'm Juan Davalos.
And I'm Brett Waite.
And you're listening to us at Radio Free Hillsdale, 101.7 FM. You can listen to us also on your podcast. Just look for us at Citizen Talk, or on SoundCloud, also Citizen Talk. And you can follow us on Twitter or Facebook at Citizen Talk FM. We'll be right back after the break. Welcome back to Citizen Talk, the show that restores prudence to politics. I'm Juan Davalos.
I'm Brett Waite.
And you're listening to us at Radio Free Hillsdale 101.7 FM. We're here with Tara Ross. She is an expert on the Electoral College, we've been talking about how it got started, what the founders thought about the Electoral College, and we want to talk also about the representation that is in the Electoral College. So what I wanted to ask you, Ms. Ross, is we have 538 electors, which it's equal to the state's representation in government. So a lot of people complain about, the Electoral College is not fair because it makes it so that people in California, their vote doesn't count as much as somebody in South Dakota. But it actually equals the amount of representation that particular state has in the federal government, because the number of electors that each state has is the number of representatives they have in the government. Is that right?
Right. So each state has the same number of electors as you have senators plus representatives in Congress. So basically that means, of course, the number of representatives you have in the House of Representatives reflects your population. California has a lot more representatives because they are a lot bigger. And Wyoming and some of the smaller states, of course, they have one because that's the minimum. And now then you also have as many electors as you have senators. Now the Senate, of course, is one state, one vote, compared to the House's one person, one vote.
Right.
So just as the Congress reflects both of these principles in its composition, so does the Electoral College.
And that's something that's very important, because that number of representation in each state is decided by the census, which is done every 10 years. And we're actually going to be having a whole episode on the census, because right now there's a question of how accurate the census has been, because at the moment everybody's being counted in the census, whether they are legal citizens of the United States or not.
Right.
And the Trump administration is trying to add the citizenship question into the next 2020 census. Do you think that would change the representation that's going to be distributed to the different states?
Well, so it will. I guess I won't step into the whole political question about that, but
right.
but it definitely will, as a practical matter. If they change the way that they conduct the census, or who is or isn't included, it will change the number of representatives, and that's why there is such a huge fight over it.
Right. Now, I did want to ask you, there are certain movements, I guess, to get rid of the Electoral College. I guess not too much through a constitutional amendment, which would be the appropriate way of doing this, because there's no support for that. But there is a movement to go around the Constitution. Can you talk to us a little bit about this?
Yes. So the movement is called the National Popular Vote Movement. It's a group that's based in California, and they are working to get states to sign on to a contract, okay, an interstate compact, a simple contract among states. Now remember, normally a constitutional amendment requires 3/4 of the states to get on board. This contract is on track to get approved with as few as like 20 or 21 states. So that's a huge difference,
Right.
and which of course is why they're doing it this way. Now the contract, what it says is simply, we promise to give our electors the winner of the national popular vote if all the rest of you do. So right now they have 14 states plus D.C. that have signed on to this contract. That is 189 electors. It is currently pending in Minnesota, Nevada, Oregon, and Wisconsin. That would be, how many votes is that? That's like 10, 6, 7 plus 10 more electoral votes. So they would be well above 200 and approaching 270 if they were to get all of those states on board. So the contract goes into effect when they have 270 electors signed on, and that's because 270 electors can win a presidential election. So basically, they will have changed the structure of the presidential election system through a simple contract, and the Electoral College would exist, but only on paper. For all intents and purposes, it would mean nothing at all. Now, there are lots of dangers associated with changing constitutional institutions by a contract,
Right.
but they're pretending like this is all okay.
Right, and I actually think it's unconstitutional because you can't have states making compacts with each other. That's why the federal government exists. So I actually believe it's unconstitutional. The problem is that you couldn't challenge it in a court until it actually happens,
Right.
Which would be too late and would be a disaster to do that.
Well, so you're right. I mean, it's hard to challenge it before it
Right.
actually got 270 and it's in effect. The argument once that happens, and I'm sure states will immediately file it, before it actually goes as far as the presidential election, if there's time. And the argument will be, look, yes, states have great discretion to allocate their electors however they want to. That's fine. But states do not have authority to allocate their electors in some way that violates another portion of the Constitution. For instance, if a state like Minnesota, which is considering this legislation, wanted to hold a presidential election that did not allow women to vote, that would be struck down because of the 19th Amendment. So, why can a state sign this contract that requires a minimum of states, or I'm sorry, a plurality, not even a majority of states, to sign, and that this is all okay? It violates Article 5 of the Constitution, which requires 3/4 of the states, a supermajority requirement.
Well, and it sounds like they want national popular vote at any cost, even at the cost of disenfranchising their own state's electors. That in itself, to me, would sound to be unconstitutional. That you would be disenfranchising your own citizens.
Right, because what you would be doing is, in a state like Colorado, which I think just signed up for this contract, even if no single person in Colorado votes for a particular presidential candidate, because whoever is running is against the interest of the people in Colorado, if that person wins the popular vote in the rest of the country, all of Colorado's votes would go to that person.
Yeah, it's a little crazy. I think I'm going to reiterate, I do not think the Electoral College is a partisan institution. It's not. Historically speaking, it has never been. But the effort to get rid of it right now, unfortunately, is driven by blue states and by Democrats who, some of which I think it's just kind of a political power play, and that's unfortunate. I really don't like that. But I also think that they're not serving themselves as much as they think they are, because there is no telling who will benefit if the Electoral College is gone. I think there's some idea that the urban areas will just start to drive elections, and Democrats are strong in the urban areas, and so it'll help them. But what will really happen is our system will kind of fall apart. The two-party system that we are so used to probably will not stick around very long. We'll start to look a little bit more like France, where they have literally 6, 10 candidates in an election, and you end up with a first run at the election where there's some candidate that gets 19% of the vote and the other one gets 18%, and then you've got a runoff between the 19% person and the 18% person. And then that's not much of an election where you have a choice between those two people in the second round of the election. Our system at least forces us to come together and to compromise and to work with each other and to come up with a good compromise candidate that represents a majority of the people.
That's a good point. The Electoral College does force one candidate to get a clear majority. You can't, because you can't win with a plurality of electoral college votes. So, yeah, that's an excellent point. That will have, I think, a significant destabilizing effect across the country.
It absolutely will.
Right, and I think it was Larry Arnn who said that this what we have in the United States is the oldest successful governing system, and to just change it for partisan purposes right now, because there's been 3 times in which it's a questionable result, even though I don't personally think so. It would be absurd to make such a drastic change that would really change the essence of the country. It would destroy federalism. It would change the dynamics of presidential elections. It would change how a president views himself as a representative for the whole people, for every state in the union, and not just for some big cities. It would really change the essence of the country.
So I'm going to follow up on that by quoting a Democrat for any Democrat who is worried that this is not going to help them. Democrat John F. Kennedy was a big supporter of the Electoral College, and he gave a speech on the Senate floor where he said, look, this is a solar system of governmental power. You can't propose to change one element of the system without affecting everything else. So I'm going to add to that and say, look, if you change the gravitational pull of the sun, you think Earth is just going to keep on going on marrying its orbit, and the weather's not going to change, and a whole mess of stuff? That's not going to happen. You change one thing, and you never know what the domino effect of that's going to be, and how you can destabilize things. And in the same way, the Electoral College has just operated very calmly and peacefully behind the scenes for centuries, and it supports our country in so many ways that I think we would not necessarily fully appreciate until it was gone.
Yeah, I think a good way to see what would happen if it's gone is actually looking at the Hunger Games. I know it's fiction, but it's looking at the United States in the future, and there you have a capital city where most of the population lives that rules tyrannically over every district around it.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what would happen, because people are self-interested. That's part of human nature. And people in the cities are going to be interested for what benefits them, and they're not going to care too much about what happens in North Dakota or South Dakota or whatever flyover country.
Absolutely.
Right. I wanted to ask you one last question. And you said that the Electoral College helps to prevent voter fraud. Can you talk a little bit more about that? How does it help to prevent voter fraud?
Sure. Right now, if you're going to steal an election, you need several things to go your way. First, you need it to be a pretty close election at the national level. Second, you need to be able to predict in advance which state, or maybe 2 or 3 states, is going to swing the election for you. Now, this is actually pretty hard to do. People laugh at this and they say, well, I know which states the swing states are. Well, I don't think anybody in 2000 knew that Florida was going to literally be decided by a couple of hundred votes. But I guess I'll tell you something else. Even if you can predict that, think Ohio 2004, where everybody was thinking this is going to be the state.
Right.
Everybody descends on that state. I'm old enough that I have friends who are lawyers that went to the state, and there were poll watchers. I mean, everybody was there watching. Now, is it impossible to steal an election? I'm not that naive. Unfortunately, humans are dishonest, and they will try when there's a lot of power at stake. But you make it as difficult as possible, and you narrow the field so that you only have to defend an isolated number of precincts all at the same time. Now, with a national popular vote, of course, you have the exact opposite situation. Any vote stolen in any part of the country, no matter how easy it was to steal, affects the national outcome. Now, I hope that we're not naive enough to think you couldn't steal a whole mess of Democratic votes in California or a whole mess of Republican votes in Texas, because you can, know, and who can be on defense in every single part of the country simultaneously? It's not doable. So it is better, our decentralized system where the election is spread out across in 51 different elections, 50 states plus D.C., 51 different elections, and you have to be able to predict where to act to make a difference. It is just much harder.
Right, and I do have one more question.
Sure.
You mentioned one of the big things against the Electoral College is that, that means that the election is only going to happen in Florida and some other, like Ohio, the swing states. But in things that you've written and in videos you've made, you've talked about swing states actually changing. Can you mention that a little more?
I'm not one to say that the election only depends on swing states. Yes, that is where it comes down to in the final weeks of the election, but the other states are certainly important. They just made up their minds earlier in the process. And, there's no Democrat that wants to go to an election without California's 55 electoral votes safely tucked away. They are important. Also, when states start to feel ignored for too long, they change.
Right.
In 2000, West Virginia decided it had been ignored by the Democratic Party for too long, and they were done. And they switched to George W. Bush. By the way, gave him the election because George W. Bush could not have won if he had not flipped that safe Democratic state to vote for him instead. There's a mess of blue wall states that voted for Donald Trump, and Hillary Clinton is wishing she'd spent more time there.
Mm-hmm. Right.
You can't ignore states. The identity of safe and swing states is not this set in stone thing. It is fluctuating. It changes. States change their minds. I mean, look, right now, I saw they were doing a bunch of polls in Texas, and they're showing how close it is in Texas for the presidential election. You never know. You cannot ignore any part of the country, and that's the beauty of our system.
Right. We're actually, broadcasting right now from Michigan, which has been a blue state for as long as I can remember. Mm-hmm. And Donald Trump identified certain issues that were important for the people of Michigan and was able to turn the state.
Exactly. And it demonstrates my point. And I'm betting that Hillary Clinton wishes she'd paid a lot more attention to you guys.
Yeah. Well, most definitely.
Yeah, it's viewing politics through that lens is viewing it as something that is stale and static and not dynamic, and something that you wouldn't need prudence to evaluate how best to appeal to voters. So.
Well, our guest today has been Tara Ross. She is the author of The Indispensable Electoral College, How the Founders' Plan Saves Our Country from Mob Rule and Enlightened Democracy, The Case for the Electoral College. You should definitely look that up. She also has many videos on Prager University on the Electoral College, and a great article on the Electoral College at heritage.com. Thank you so much for being with us, Ms. Ross.
Thanks for having me.
It's a very important topic that we're talking about because, like we were saying with her, it would really change the essence of the country. The country, I liked the analogy that she used about it being a sort of like the whole system works together. And if you take one part out, it affects the other parts. And we need to be careful of changing too much because the whole system can be affected by it.
Yeah, that's a good point. And also, I want to offer a friendly correction, Juan. But so in Article 1, Section 10, which no one pays attention to Article 1 anymore, so I don't blame anyone for missing this. It says that no state shall, without the consent of Congress, lay any duty of tonnage, keep troops or ships of war in times of peace, or enter into any agreement or compact with another state or with a foreign power, so on and so forth. So with regard to the national popular vote, if they're going to do this, it would require the consent of Congress. Now, with regard to whether or not a compact can undermine a constitutional institution, that I think would be an entirely separate question.
Right, and so during the interview I mentioned to Ms. Ross that it seemed to me that it was unconstitutional for states to make compacts with each other. I guess I should have clarified that it's unconstitutional for them to do that without getting the approval for Congress. And that's something that we were looking at the National Popular Vote movement website, and they do acknowledge that they need that approval from Congress, but they're saying that they don't need the approval for Congress until all of the states that are going to be part of this compact have agreed to it. But anyway, we do want you to look at the Electoral College because it's an important issue, and because it really is a way in which we elect the president from the state that we are in. It is not a national election. The way we elect the president is not a national election because we are a union of states. We are not one large state. And maybe the reason that the Electoral College is being fought against so much in recent history is that we've lost that identity in the country as members of states, and we now see states are as irrelevant.
Yeah, I think that's true. And regarding the Declaration of Independence, which says governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. But the question is then, how much can the theory of consent be changed or altered so that it doesn't lose its essence, but it works in practice? And of course, that's one thing that the founders struggled with. And I think that in terms of whether or not it should become the norm, or whether or not it should be rare, where a president wins the Electoral College but loses the popular vote, if that becomes common, if that were to become the norm, do you think that would have a destabilizing effect on the country? Or
Yeah, I actually, that's a good question, because I think if that starts becoming the norm, well, even if you would say, well, theoretically, I would still defend the Electoral College, because you'd still have to take into account what would happen if you get rid of it.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning small states, nobody's going to care about small states anymore. Presidents are only going to be representing big states or big cities now. So that is a big problem of getting rid of the Electoral College. So you have to think about what happens if you get rid of it. But that being said, I think if that continues happening, where presidents lose the popular vote but win the Electoral College vote, that is going to have a destabilizing effect, because more and more people will be convinced that the Electoral College is the wrong way to choose the president. So I think it'll lose legitimacy in people's minds.
Yeah, that is perhaps something to be concerned about. Although, from a prudential perspective, I would want to look at consistently where are the votes the excess of votes coming from. So
right.
For example, is it always California and New York that are giving huge amounts of votes to the loser
right.
of the Electoral
right.
College?
Well,
because if that's the case, then I would certainly still be in favor of defending the Electoral College based on the stabilizing effect that it would still have, because you'd have to get a majority of states.
Right, and that's also why the census is so important, right? Because if we do have right now in the country, estimates are between 11 and 40 million illegal immigrants in the country, and they are being counted for purposes of representation right now.
Mm-hmm.
Then that means that states like California or New York, or states with larger illegal immigrant populations, have a lot more representation than they would if you would only count citizens.
Yes, to go to your point earlier about Hunger Games, we'd be ruled by blue capitals, but I don't know how much of a sanctuary they would be.
Right. Well, that's all the time we have for today. You've been listening to Citizen Talk, the show that restores prudence to politics. I'm Juan Davalos.
And I'm Brett Waite.
And you're listening to Radio Free Hillsdale 101.7 FM. You can listen to us on podcast. Go to iTunes, to the podcast app, and look for Citizen Talk. You can also look for us on SoundCloud or on Facebook or Twitter at Citizen Talk FM. We'll see you next week.